So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining this morning's session. My name is Jake Geithner. I'm one of the co-directors of this year's conference and a junior landscape architecture student at Cornell. I'll be your MC for the session. If you have any questions for today's speaker, please use the Zoom Q&A feature throughout the presentation and we'll take all questions at the end. If you are a licensed professional and would like to receive one CEU for this course, please visit labash.org/lacies. Now I'm honored to introduce our speaker. Selena Martinez is a member of the Pasquayaqui tribe and is Chicana born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona. She completed her Master's of Architecture degree from Arizona State University in 2020 and is currently pursuing her architectural license. She has been involved in a diversity of projects with local tribal nations through the Arizona State Indigenous Design Collaborative. Selena is the co-founder and lead instructor for Design Empowerment Phoenix, a program of the Sagrada Gallery in South Phoenix that provides opportunities for youth and community to engage in design tools and processes. Today, Selena will be presenting her talk, Indigenous Placekeeping, Plurality, and Futurities. Selena, the room is yours.
Thank you, Jake. I'll share screen now and present. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. Very happy and excited to share some of the work that I've been involved in within the Indigenous Design Collaborative, along with some of my own personal work through Design Empowerment Phoenix. So just a little bit more context of where I come from in Arizona. I was born and raised here in Phoenix, but my tribal homelands are actually here in Sonora, Mexico, along the Rio Yaqui. The Indigenous Design Collaborative really focuses on illuminating the narratives of Indigenous peoples and specifically trying to incorporate and bring in more Indigenous designers into the design industry. And as we see here on this map, there are 567 tribes within the United States of America, or what is today called the United States of America. Within the context of Arizona, there are 22 tribes, which for us, that means there's about 55,000 youth in the pipeline in Arizona. There's about 3,000 plus Indigenous students at ASU and about 52 Indigenous design students within our design school. And Wanda Della Costa is actually the founder of the Indigenous Design Collaborative, and she is the first female Indigenous architect from Canada. And she has definitely been an influence and mentor for myself and many other students who have been able to take her courses and also participate in the Indigenous Design Collaborative. So our vision is really about preparing that next generation of designers that focuses on, transforming the field and incorporating cultures and innovation within design fields. Along with that, creating understanding, inclusiveness, and accuracy in the field while illuminating undervalued and under-examined ancestral worldviews and value systems within design. At the moment, we have about 2 faculty, 1 interns, and 4 students within the collaborative. And placekeeping is a term that Wanda utilizes a lot in contrast to placemaking. And really what this is about is taking, placemaking in contrast is about, enhancing place for the people who live and work there through arts and cultural activities, whereas Indigenous placekeeping or placekeeping is actually led by people with lived experience and people who are citizen experts. It's aligned with local value systems and assets. It includes ways of knowing, being, values, and process. It utilizes holistic measures of wellness, socially, culturally, spiritually, physically, and economically. And what you see on the right here is actually the framework that Wanda has created, the 4-part framework that is focused on these 4 aspects: community-led, process-based, place-based, and reciprocity-driven. The community-led aspect is really about engaging with the people who live in these communities in which we are working with and who invite us into their communities. They are the experts of their communities. As outsiders, we do not understand what it is like to live in their environment. We do not immediately know, just because we are Indigenous, what their culture is about and what their worldview is about and what the dynamics of their community is. So really allowing them to take lead in the conversation when it comes to design and development is really important for us. Process-based, promoting the importance of creating a longer process with, or understanding that a longer process may arise when working with Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples because of the, the need to establish a strong relationship, a genuine relationship that with the people that we're working with. And this also includes a variety of engagements depending on the client's needs and the scale of the project. In this photo on the right, this is actually a live 3D modeling kind of experiment that we were able to do around Indigenous housing with the Gila River Indian community. Place-based, really trying to tap into and understand that vernacular design intelligence of the people of this place, looking back to those ancestral roots and beginning to understand that there is a lot of knowledge already embedded in these environments and within these communities that have unfortunately over time been undervalued and invalidated. So reconnecting to those and utilizing those as key parts to our design process. And then reciprocity driven, which is one of the most important aspects of this framework, because this is really about giving back, and making sure what we are creating is something of value for the community, and that is validated by the community, that value. Is this something that is actually meaningful and responsive to the needs and aspirations that they are asking of us? And we definitely do not want to have that dynamic where we're taking more than we are giving. One of the major projects as a case study that we underwent was this ASU campus placemaking book that focused on, was led by Indigenous students and focused on how we can incorporate more Indigenous designs and understandings and education within our built environment. So we created this publication, had a variety of methodologies, along with visualizations that students were able to create, and a bunch of research about the local tribes here within the context of ASU, and basically just reimagining a campus that better reflects the Indigenous and ancestral people who were here and who are still here. And through that book, we were actually able to be hired by the university, because this book throwing all of these visions and ideas into a publication without the expectation that it will be created actually returned to us through some hired work actually by the president of ASU, which was pretty crazy. But this is one of the projects. This is an autumn storytelling table, and the designs from the river is kind of the perfect little synopsis of it, because the influence of these motifs here were brought to us by an Indigenous artist, Jeffrey Fulwilder, of the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. And the local O'odham tribes have an ancestral tradition of basketry designs that derive from the desert. And, the basket weavers harvest cattails, willow, beargrass, and, the white of yucca plants during certain times of the year. And they utilize that to create this basketry that also are embedded with stories through the patterns. So this is a rendering here, but on the left-hand corner, we are actually under or still in fabrication at the moment, and hopefully this project will come to the library hopefully by the end of this month. But yeah, this table will actually be sitting in the Labriola collection, which is actually the Indigenous or Native American collection at our main ASU library. This is another case study. This actually happened before the other project. And this is an Indigenous welcome wall that focused on creating or incorporating a welcome, all the welcomes or hellos from the 22 tribes of Arizona. And we actually were able once again to hire Indigenous artists, 3 local street artists who brought a unique style and a very rare interpretation of how we can begin to, connect to the younger generation through a different way of doing signage. And it was such a great process to be able to work with those artists and utilize their hand styles and incorporate them into such an institutional building. So that was really exciting. And I was actually the designer for both of these projects, or the person doing the drawings. But I would say most of the influence came from the Indigenous artists that we worked with. And this idea of placekeeping is connected to this next concept of plurality. So to further understand that idea of placekeeping, plurality is a lens in which we have been utilizing since reading this book called Designs for the Pluriverse by Arturo Escobar. I believe he's a South American academic, and I highly recommend that book. It's amazing. But so Indigenous cultures, lifestyles, pre-contact were explicitly interconnected with our relationships to the environment. And there was this strong localization in place and nature. And the concept of the pluriverse is really about a world where many worlds fit. So infinite diversity. And one of the ways that we have illustrated this is through divergent climates, and how, I'm over here in the desert, you guys may be in a different climate, and that diversity informs and creates cultures, which creates this plurality. So this is an image from Native Land CA, which shows that infinite diversity and illustrates the amount of Indigenous peoples who were here and their territories that they claim. So this is a quote from the book that almost overnight, a diverse range of rich and ranged traditions were reduced to being worth literally nothing. nondescript manifestations of an allegedly indubitable fact under development. So this is really just an amazing visual to see for us. And I think, you know, our cultures were ripped away from us, and the people, the community, the environment, and the resources from that point were, or from various points, were exploited over time. And another concept from that book as well is this idea of defuturing design. So, you know, there have been long periods of defuturing acts, you know, within the historical understanding prior, or I think a lot of suppressed histories and narratives, you know, since the influence of Christopher Columbus and colonization. But a lot of these defuturing acts, even the ones that we see today, are in the name of progress. And these disruptive outside patterns of colonization continues today. And we see that through urbanization, modernization, globalization, and they have strong impacts on Indigenous communities, and they're almost like microcosms where you're seeing that direct impact on these communities who have, you know, been in survival mode for so long. And I love this quote right here, that is, "The territory is our life, and life is not sold, it is loved and defended." And I have a variety of examples and visuals here, but I think that, you know, for Indigenous peoples, we feel that there is this attack or this persecution because we want to live a life of autonomy and not dependency. Our territory is a true history book, and it keeps those traditions alive. Considering living entities with embedded, and they're considered living entities with embedded memories. They hold knowledge, sacred sites, seeds, rituals, languages. And, you know, all of these defuturing acts create a multiplicity of interconnected, wicked problems with immense generational impacts. So, you know, when we're thinking about plurality, it's just a world full of infinite diversity, and it's really what that illuminates is just that we need to acknowledge that there is more than one, and there's more than just the dominant society's narrative, and we need to understand that dominant society, that dominant narrative shapes our perception of the world, and we need to broaden that. Broaden that Western understanding of the world. So concepts of Indigenous worldviews are often unthinkable from the perspective of Eurocentric theories. And what you see here, these graphics, these are actually influenced from an Indigenous academic or researcher, Sean Wilson, who has kind of created this framework that he calls research to ceremony. And this diagram for us are those ways of being. So he explains it probably slightly different than I will hear today, but so ways of being and ways of knowing, these can be considered epistemology and ontology within academia, and Indigenous values and ways of doing would be considered axiology and methodology within academia. So these ways of being and these ways of knowing are actually this process of relationships that shape our reality. And then the Indigenous values and the ways of doing are about maintaining accountability to those relationships. So ways of being is about, you know, I have some terms here: being in relation, place-based, ceremony, storytelling. And I think one of the key things, at least for me, that I see as a kind of constant way to better understand somebody else's worldview is through emergent stories. And this is really, those roots and understanding where we come from. And people often call them myths, but there's a lot of embeddedness and metaphor of those ancestral values and relationship with environment. Ways of knowing, this can look like a variety of ways of accumulating knowledges. And this idea of foreknowledges comes from weaving Indigenous and sustainable sciences to diversify our methods by Kahete. So he outlines 4 ways of gaining knowledge. 1, contemporary, gained through experience, education, and problem solving. Empirical, gained through careful observation and practice over time. And this is really about that place-based knowledge of being and living and understanding an environment. Revealed is gained through vision, ritual, and ceremony. Traditional is handed down based on stories and experiences of people through time. Indigenous values, what we're really trying to illustrate here is, through this example on the right, is Indigenous comes from welfare culture from the Native Wellness Institute. And this is a very complex diagram explaining the interconnectedness of Indigenous values-based healing and all of the different elements that can go into that and should be considered when thinking about Indigenous values-based healing. It's not a simplified version. It is shown with its complexity. And I feel like those Indigenous values can look like a variety of things too, and be varied for different people. So ways of doing is really about the methodology. So protocol, reciprocity, that process-based aspect, community-led. And I think for me, the prime example that I have utilized is the Indigenous Placekeeping framework. But, really just understanding that there are so many ways, so many frameworks, so many methodologies that we can utilize as hybrid versions on how to approach working within and for not only Indigenous communities, but communities of color. And this is an example that I will talk more about, a little bit further on in my presentation, but there is an important focus on the relationship between design and culture. The fact that design is about creating cultural meanings and practices, about designing culture, experience, and particular ways of living. This example is actually an example from my culture. This is the Yaqui deer dancer. You guys are unfamiliar, but he is a significant symbol from our more Indigenous roots pre-colonization. And I think the strongest thing about this is showing that connection, the design in his regalia to nature, to specific species, not only with what he's wearing, but even the instruments that play as he dances. And really exemplifying, that connection between design, culture, and our environment. The pluriverse acknowledges and validates humanity's interconnectedness as a species through concepts such as ancestrality, autonomy, and futurality. And this diagram is the 7 generations diagram that we've created to understand kind of this past, present, future kind of outlook on how we move forward with this new understanding of plurality and how we go about our work. So how we see ourselves inheriting our role to maintain, a future for our next generation. This is really about a better balance of incorporating Indigenous and Western methodologies and mindsets to create successful projects. And, really understanding that this process can engage beyond a single lifetime. Which brings us to futurity. And this is really about our ability to envision a different future. And actually, Indigenous Futurity specifically is kind of, I guess in the past, several years, there's been a really big push by Indigenous peoples to kind of reclaim their narratives through imagining ourselves in the future. So past future visions where we construct self-determined representations and alternative narratives about our identities and futures. On the right, this is actually, I can't remember the name, but this is a video game that somebody created to imagine that futurity of Indigenous peoples within the future context of Toronto. Some of the people who are doing Indigenous Futurities are creating these kind of almost like rendering-like or artist-type style of visualizations of themselves or their culture in the future, and they're so interesting to look at. And they're hosted on some websites like Initiative for Indigenous Futures, where they commission or showcase artists and to illustrate themselves, or their community 7 generations from now, which is totally aligned with that generational viewpoint. This is another group, Cultural Organizing. And they also do something similar where they have a variety of different mediums. They showcase different activists, artists, and people who are kind of trying to gear towards this type of futurity work. And I think, this is something I actually saw on Instagram, which is really amazing, and it's connected to that plurality or that multiverse where there can be many worlds within our world. And I think a way to showcase that is actually through that idea of communal dreaming and how we use dreaming as a method of envisioning beyond what no longer serves us, beyond the status quo, essentially. And that can look like a variety of things to different people. And I think maybe some of the more academic way or approach of understanding is more through this idea of speculative design and how design speculations act as a catalyst for collectively redefining our relationship to reality. So putting ideas out there similar to what we did with that Placekeeping book that I shared at the beginning. We were just envisioning a future. Maybe we weren't really thinking about it in the sense of futurity, but we were envisioning a future where Indigenous voices or Indigenous students would feel more welcome on campus. And somehow, that was able to get in the hands of somebody who can make that happen. So I think that's really what this is about sharing ideas and starting that dialogue. And really being critical of, our current methods and not just sticking to a single-minded kind of approach. And there's a variety of ways that I think we can see this, within science fiction, within this idea of critical designs, and it flows on a spectrum of unconstrained to constrained. And this comes to some of my, my independent project or basically my thesis for my master's program. The project is called Bachia, which means seed in the Yaqui language. And the whole intent of my project was to look at our traditional plant and food knowledge to help better create that multi-generational dialogue and to increase the evolution and resilience as a tribe, prioritizing health and food sovereignty, and trying to develop a vision that responds to the demands, needs, and hopes for the next generations of Yaquis to come. And the way that I framed my project was definitely different than what most students were doing in their independent projects. So yeah, it took more of, I suppose, a storytelling approach, but it's really based in a past, present, future, which really aligns with this idea of futurity. So really, looking at the past, where do we come from? What are our roots? And how has the past constructed the present? Creating a better understanding for myself of where I come from in relation to the literal location, the solstices and equinoxes, the different seasons, the different rain seasons, the different planting seasons, our fiestas as a tribe, and then, that historical understanding of our homeland to our migration and where we are now in a variety of different communities, not only here in the United States, but, still in our homeland, and kind of leading that path up north. And this is kind of my interpretation of what I began to accumulate as knowledge about our more indigenous roots versus kind of more of the influence of Catholicism on our culture. So our emergent story is about this talking tree. And this talking tree comes to us and shares to the Surem, who are our ancestors, that we were going to be transformed into human beings. Or we had the choice to be transformed into ants, sea creatures, skybirds, inhabitants of the wilderness, or we chose to become Yoemit, which means a Yaqui person. And so for me, that really illuminates that connection to our environment, that those different species in nature are actually our ancestors. And I think that's actually quite beautiful to see it in that way. Along with this idea of these different worlds that you see around the tree, this is actually the actual form of our real Yaqui. And we have 8 original pueblos that still exist here in Sonora, Mexico. And then from there, I see, that emergent story, the real Yaqui, as the seed for all of those different species and those connections to Quaresma, our medicinal plants, and even the animals and fauna that are, are embedded in our stories. And these different species can be considered cultural keystone species, which are essentially, really notable species to people, identified by its significance in their diets, materials, medicines, languages, traditions, histories, and spiritual practices. And this comes back, kind of to that notion that I spoke to before of, our territory holds those stores and is embedded with that knowledge that we utilize and is, incorporated into the design of our cultures. And this is kind of what I was sharing before, the specific species that are connected to our Yaqui deer dancer, even down to a specific species of moth that we use as sound makers on the ankles, and even the specific the shrub that those moths place their cocoons on and evolve in the environment that has that species. And all these species are embedded in the context of real Yaqui. And really trying to find ways to move forward and think about understanding our trauma, our migration, maybe the current disconnects to our real Yaqui environment. For me, growing up here in Phoenix, I never went to Ryoyaki, we never really talked about Ryoyaki. So there's a big disconnect in between communities and understanding where we actually come from. Transition, that transition culturally to these new contexts and adapting to this idea of reservations and these new urban Yaqui communities. So moving those towards healing, pride, reconnection, balance, and evolution. And within the present, really trying to envision what is the potential of our existing community infrastructure. So this is within the context of Guadalupe, which is one of the communities that I associate myself with. Gaining community feedback and existing programming for the existing, or understanding the existing programming was really important for me because of the work that I was involved in through the IDC. I couldn't see myself doing a authentic, project with my community if there was no type of engagement, which, is not really typically done within the context of academia. I feel like it's more of people stray away from it because of implications of building relationships and, kind of the need for it to be a longer process. So I was able to engage with a youth group through actually the design empowerment program that I created, which I'll talk about later. But this is really about having the youth identify, the different actors who are in this site that I was looking at, the different activities that were happening there, the artifacts, the atmospheres, because once again, they are the experts of their community. Also connecting with elders, trying to better understand, what they see the needs are in the community and things that they would utilize. So trying to bridge that connection between the younger generation and the elders. And this led to my development of the programming options for what I was trying to envision within this context. And I wanted to make it something tangible in phases that potentially could happen in the future. So first one was looking at a medicine food garden. And this was, thinking about the benefits for the community, introducing microclimates, a teaching learning opportunity, encouraging community harvesting, restoring those sacred medicines within the urban settings because of the disconnect to our homelands. Other supporting programming for that could be a yerberia, a health foods market, and a variety of other aspects that could be connected to that food garden. And I felt like this was something, that could actually potentially happen in the nearer future. Building on top of that, if that was successful, maybe it could evolve into an urban farming school. So this could be something where the youth can learn how to grow and cook food. There's indoor and outdoor learning spaces, uniting youth with traditional foods and plants, and basically just reconnecting that next generation with our cultural roots in the context of the specific species and the plants that come from our homelands. And third, a biocultural heritage oasis. So this is really about expanding on both of these ideas and creating more of, I suppose, an innovation center or a leadership center to promote these types of jobs for career mentorship for farmers, ranchers, gardeners, botanists, and healers, having a seed bank and indigenous food production on site. And this is actually, the form of the Ryoyaki for those who are unfamiliar. But basically, it's at the bottom of the Sonoran Desert and very near the equator. So there's a lot more variety in species down here in comparison to the Phoenix context. Unfortunately, due to adjacencies of developing cities next to the original villages, a a lot of the water that typically would flow into this river has been redirected to these cities and dammed up. So at this point, there's a lot of stagnancy within the water, and it doesn't flow like it once did, which definitely affects the ability for even people in our homelands to maintain these different species that we utilize in our practices and within our lifestyles. So this is actually the site. The building is called the Mercado. So it's actually just like kind of like a plaza building that currently exists in the in the community. And it's just, for me, I saw it as underutilized. The tenants, there's not a lot of tenants currently in it. I think about like half of the tenants are full within the building. So I wanted to like tap into something that already exists and enhance it instead of creating an architecture that was new. And this project actually became more of a landscape architecture, which probably aligns pretty well with this conference. But yeah, so I just incorporated a variety of gardens in connection to the species that I mentioned before, and enhanced some of the features that were already there, like an amphitheater, introduced a seed bank, and utilized the, pretty obviously the form of the Rio Yaqui to also reconnect people to that for those who have not went back to our homelands. These are some of the renderings I created. So this is the seed bank, submerged underground, the amphitheater. We definitely love to dance and party. A space for the youth. This was something that the elders actually suggested, a place where they could take their grandchildren to hang out during the day instead of just being at home all day. So this is a rain splash pad where this water could be filtered back into the environment. And then a mariposario, which is actually that a butterfly encatchment, but in this context, it's for those moths to harvest those cocoons for the cultural practices. And then moving into the future, what are our aspirations for the future? What can we provide for that next generation to come? And this is really that third vision of how can we re-migrate, in a sense, between our different communities, reconnecting that knowledge, having a seed bank in each community, migrating between campuses as an ecological education program, and once again, supporting those careers that are not, I feel are not pushed as a priority, but really enhance that food sovereignty and even just in general cultural sovereignty for our community. And so this work that I just showed you, that was my independent project, but with all of the momentum I had doing that, I actually decided to apply to this grant from the Indian Collective, which was called the Radical Imagination Grant, and it focused on supporting artists who are focused on enhancing that futurity or bringing a new outlook or narrative or conversation to their community. So I was lucky enough to get chosen for that, for the proposal I submitted, and I'm extremely grateful. But some of the words that I utilized in that grant language was, reclaiming autonomy within our communities, disrupting that dominant narrative with voices typically suppressed, that multi-generational discussions and perspectives to guide the process, utilizing speculative design and design visualizations to empower communities to imagine that Indigenous futurity, and co-designing scenarios that incorporate notions of our past and present conditions towards futures that are sensitive to the aspirations of our future generations. So this is the work that I'm currently working on. And I've also structured it in a similar way to my thesis, kind of expanding on that idea. So far, I've been able, unfortunately, due to the implications of COVID, it has created some engagement setbacks, but immediately I was able to support some of our people in Real Yaqui by donating some money so that they could get some assistance with care packages for families. Secondly, kind of just finished up this first task phase of building the infrastructure. And now I'm currently in this present phase of exploring some of the documenting and archiving our current infrastructure to then move into the future and design with the youth of our community. The project is called Webinaria, and this actually means plural in our Yaqui language. And once again, it's really about creating a past, present, future representation of Yaqui narratives and illustrating those varied identities of Yoamed people to envision those connections to our homeland. This is some of the stuff that I have on my website for the project. I'm hosting it on my personal website, but have things like our Emergent Story if people from our community don't know about that, because we're typically taught the more Catholicism roots, because our culture is a hybrid. Mapping, Yaqui mapping, and historical timeline. And more presently, in the presente kind of portion of the project, is actually utilizing tech such as 3D scanning to begin to document and archive these important places, and to use these as kind of like the base for those future visualizations. So this is our Guadalupe Yaqui Cemetery, and it's really exciting to be able to capture this. I guess the community or the cemetery has been wanting to create actually an archive or a map of these, of the people who are here because they don't have one yet. So that is an asset that I can give back to the community. This is another Yaqui community, Penghamo. This is actually where I live. And this is a walkway that illustrates our culture and even has like a mural of our map. But this is really, hopefully as I progress, I'm able to host these 3D models where people can interact with them and navigate them on a website. Whether they're like in Real Yaqui and they don't know what the communities are like here, or maybe at some point I will be also visiting Real Yaqui. So maybe if I capture data there, people will also be able to experience that in a digital world. And then really quickly, I just wanted to talk about Design Empowerment Workshop and how this aligns with some of this thinking and how it's kind of like happening at the same time for me. So this is a workshop held out of the Sagrado Galleria, and this is really about self-taught design enlightenment and really about, I was invited into this community by a local activist who was empowered by participating or being asked by the city in some meeting that he was involved in about infrastructure coming into the community, and they asked him to develop a vision. And he actually went out, connected with a local design firm or architecture firm, and they assisted him in creating some renderings. And he brought that back to the table, and they were just like blown away that he had took that initiative to go out and, create that. And it did definitely disrupt, but yeah, the whole idea is, about reclaiming that control. And, him inviting me in to create this, he was like, can you just create something, a one-day workshop for people to better understand and gain design awareness? And yeah, that's kind of what happened here. And we have been able to connect with a variety of youth groups to engage in this type of work. And this brings in this idea of cultural chakras and how we begin to identify these points within the community that are embedded or have this energy that promote healing, well-being, creativity, culture practices, and sustainability to strengthen community ownership. So this is still a developing kind of idea, but I think it's really embedded in how we go about the work, how we connect with community, how we're trying to increase the numbers of people of color within the industry to really bring in those narratives that have, once again, not been lifted up over time. These are some of the projects along that central area, and also this community is one of those communities that have is predominantly people of color, and is historically Phoenix has pushed people of color this way south of the tracks of downtown to this area, and now a light rail is actually going to be coming down central, which has huge implications on the community, and has been a very chaotic process that has been brought here. These are some of the things you can find on our website, Design Empowerment PHX, some of the renderings we're creating to help in kind of combating some of that, or making sure that we are able to incorporate voices from the community in this development. This is our most current project that we're creating in the backyard of the gallery, actually. So we are creating a meditation space, and this is just a quick rendering from another designer of our group, utilizing parametric design to create a shade structure in the back of the building. So this is the Sagrado, and this is the backyard. And this is actually the base of the project, and we've actually been able to connect to that vernacular design intelligence and bring more hands-on workshops to create Adobe blocks, actually, to give a nod to the people who were here before us, and to understand that we should be building this way within this climate. And how come we have a bunch of glass buildings here in the desert, and that's not actually a positive thing? It's not a way to build in response to our climate. So reconnecting people with these, the turnout has been amazing. We actually had a workshop yesterday, and it's just so exciting to see people engaging in these processes, these alternative ways of doing things. So yeah, this is what I've had for you. I hope you guys have been able to take something away from what I have shared today. And quick shout out, follow our Indigenous, or go check out more of our work on our Indigenous Design Collaborative page at the ASU Herberger Institute and our design school. You can find more of my work on my Instagram, or my website, SelenaMartinez.com. And then Design Empowerment Phoenix is also where you can find more of the work here that's happening in Phoenix. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Selena. That was a great presentation. And to reiterate on your closing thoughts there, all of our attendees can find the links to all of Selena's kind of outlets on our website as well. So now we have about 5 or so minutes for questions. We have quite a few in the Q&A. So I'll begin with a question from Mitch Glass. He goes, "Thank you for a great presentation. Can you speak more about your Arizona State University campus plan project, including the engagement process with Indigenous communities, any recommendations from a public space and built form perspective, and the role of ASU in that process?"
Yeah, so this initiative was led by Wanda, the founder of the Indigenous Design Collaborative, and she basically had a handful of Indigenous design students take part in this process to develop this publication. So it wasn't necessarily a huge engagement process with all of these Indigenous communities, but yes, in like the projects that I was sharing, we did connect with the cultural departments of a lot of those tribes to make sure we had the right spelling for like some of the sayings in the welcome wall and things like that. And I think our approach to that engagement has mainly been through the artists and understanding through their lens, is it appropriate to utilize this in the context of this institution. So for us, you know, taking part in a huger engagement process with communities was not necessarily, I think, tangible for us to do within, you know, the scope and timeline that the I guess in the context of the library was allowing us. So, you know, kind of navigating through that through the lived experience of these artists who have understanding and are from these communities, I guess, was our way of engaging. And then, you know, ASU, I believe even the Native American Indian group here on campus, they are actually even going through a rebranding with Wanda's with her private firm to reimagine, you know, their branding and how they can be more inclusive to all Indigenous peoples, because 22 tribes is a lot, but I'm sure there's more than just 22 from, you know, attending ASU. So it is very chaotic, but I would say there's a variety of different ways you can approach it. You know, maybe a simpler one, well, I guess not simpler because of language, but, you know, even incorporating languages. These land acknowledgements are not enough. We have a land acknowledgement like somewhere on campus that nobody looks at, nobody sees. So I think really incorporating that narrative back in, that place-based narrative back in, is really the place to start.
Awesome. So next we have a question from Letitia Yellowhawk. How do you become more involved with programs such as those you explored today? I come from the Shoshone tribe in central Nevada, and I would really like to jump on board with outer communities to revisit our ancestral ways and practicing sustainability while living in a modernized world.
Yeah, it's definitely a struggle. I had never even thought Indigenous architecture could be a route for me until I met Wanda. I was considering not even pursuing architecture until I saw somebody who looked like me in the profession. And I think really that's, for me, what I want to kind of pass forward for the next generations is, you know, how can I be that person for maybe all of these people that I'm interacting with, or these youth that I'm interacting with? How can I potentially, you know, show them that, you know, people like us, people that look like us can be in these positions and be designing for our communities? I just never thought that that was even a route for me. So I think trying to connect with people who are doing the work, you know, even if it's not within your context, is really important. I know there's a variety of schools that now have like Indigenous Design Collectives or Design Collectives or Planning Collectives, things like that. So I think it's all really exciting. I would say do some research into that, and maybe there may be some closer outlets for you to explore. And if not, create something yourself, because who else is going to do the work?
Thank you. That's great advice. We have time for one more question here. So with one of the crucial principles of the placekeeping framework being community or tribal led, what advice do you have for work in design education where you are unable to bring Indigenous partners into the conversation, either, you know, in fear of stretching those tribal capacities and being more of a burden than of a help and such?
Oh yeah, that's a quite difficult one. I'm not sure how to navigate that. I think, you know, if the project is focused on Indigenous communities, you should be consulting with those Indigenous people, and they should be leading that project. How is that relevant for their community if they're not participating in the decision making, in the ways of going about these projects and the protocol? So I think that's really when it comes to like, are these dominant methodologies really the best alignment for our Indigenous communities, or how can we find some sort of hybrid version of that? And, you know, having Indigenous researchers on the project, Indigenous academics, is maybe the way to start. Even though they're not from that specific community, they can still assist in creating that connection and understanding of what is appropriate ways to work within and with Indigenous communities.
Fantastic. So on that note, we're going to end today's session. Thank you so much, Selena, for joining us and for a wonderful presentation. Once again, for all of our licensed professionals who are looking to get LACES credit from this course, be sure to check out labash.org/LACES. And please be sure to kind of check in with our remaining keynote sessions for this afternoon. Heterogeneous Futures by Diana Fernandez, Critical Perspectives on Spatial Practice with Dr. Ghazal Jafari, Consani de Klerk, and Ana Maria Duran Calisto, and a closing keynote presentation with Dr. Diane Jones-Allen and Dr. Austin Allen. Enjoy the rest of today's conference, and thanks again, Selena, for the time.
Thank you. Bye.